Owing to my perusal of the history of the abbess, I overslept and was woken by Anna Wirtz. She was talking and gesticulating as she shook me awake. An excited state being the usual condition of Anna Wirtz, I did not take any particular notice until she handed me my hearing trumpet and forced it, so to speak, into position. I had just dropped in to ask her advice about a piece of embroidery I intended to apply on some velvet I happened to have for some time, a fine piece of velvet in its way, and really looked like new, although I must have had it before I came here. As you know, I never got a moment of time to myself to take the smallest recreation, and I do enjoy just sitting alone and sewing beads into some fanciful sort of flower. But people cannot be expected to understand one gets more pleasure from being alone and working at something inspired than just running off one's feet at all sorts of tasks which really are the responsibility of other people. Banging the table with my hearing trumpet, I shouted, "For the love of peace, Anna, come to the point. What ails you?" Experience had taught me that any kind of diffidence in dealing with Anna's monologues was doomed beforehand. "Well, you don't really have to shout. I was just about to explain how she came running out just like an escaped steamroller and grabbed me, gibbering, literally gibbering, and before I had time to resist, you know how strong she is, she pulled me inside the bungalow, and of course the poor thing was stiff and dead. I was so extremely shocked. 'Anna,' I yelled, now thoroughly frightened, 'what are you talking about?' 'Why, about poor Maud. Can't you understand? She died during the night, and we are all so upset, and I knew you were friendly with her. There I was, banging away on your door, but nothing seemed to wake you up. Then poor Natasha, you know how very sensitive she is. Well, she has had to retire to bed. She's so terribly shocked and sad that Dr. Gambit has had to give her sleeping tablets, at least 3, although I never did notice that she was such a great friend of poor Maud. Did you?' 'No, indeed I had not, but I did see the chocolate fudge like an apparition. Chocolate fudge containing something out of a packet that had been meant for somebody else. Poor Maud with her dainty flowered blouses and M. de Rose face powder. Her peach crêpe de chine cami knickers, which we all envied and which had taken us 6 months to sew. Timid, sensitive Maud, the only one of our number that had in any way resembled the dear old lady of tradition, with fluffy white hair, pink cheeks and white teeth. False, of course, but white. It was easy to picture poor Maud sitting under a bower of rambling roses in some old-world garden full of hollyhocks and lavender, sewing dainty cami knickers through all eternity. I was deeply shocked by the terrible news, especially as I might have saved her life if only I'd warned her when I saw her emerging out of Natasha's igloo and gone to seek medical attention immediately. This put me in a dreadfully awkward situation. Should I repeat what I'd seen in the kitchen between Natasha and Mrs. von Tucht? Obviously it seemed best to inform Dr. Gambit immediately, especially as Natasha and Mrs. von Tucht might continue making chocolate fudge, having failed to extinguish their victim at the first attempt. This, of course, would make Dr. Gambit wonder why I'd been peeking through the window myself, and there was no dignified explanation that I could think of. Common greed or inquisitive nosiness were the obvious conclusions. Perhaps Mrs. von Tucht and Natasha would go to gaol. I knew of no age limit for imprisonment, especially if it concerned murder. It would still be murder, I supposed, even if they got the wrong victim. In England they would no doubt have undergone capital punishment, in which case I would have to risk saying nothing at all, as nobody could convince me of the morality in deliberately sending somebody to their death. In the meantime I was fully dressed, but felt no real appetite for breakfast. Anna Wirtz was telling me something. "We could easily climb on the roof and look through the skylight. There is a small ladder at the back of the bungalow which is used when the gutters are to be cleaned out. They never seem to clean them out, but the ladder is still there. I would like to get a look at poor Maud, because we will never see her again. Such a fragile woman." Anna was suggesting that we should climb on the roof and spy on Maud's corpse. Horrible and dishonest from anybody else's point of view, but who would ever expect 2 old ladies to be perched on a roof? We had to push our way through a lot of undergrowth in order to be able to approach the bungalow without being seen. I felt as if we were playing at Boy Scouts. The ladder at the back of the bungalow seemed alarmingly old and the wood looked rotten. Anna Wirtz, who had stopped talking for the first time since I had known her, had begun climbing cautiously up the ladder. I hoped that she would not find it imperative to give a running commentary once we were up there, as discovery would be ignominious. I hauled myself up the creaking ladder in the wake of Anna Wirtz. The roof of the bungalow was flat and had 2 skylights which emitted light to the rooms below. We installed ourselves over the one that gave a perfect view of Maud's room. Death had converted Maud's face into a narrow, unrecognisable mask that somehow reminded me of a thin slice of unripe pumpkin. Her mouth was half open, and she stared up at us with an expression of mingled reproach and surprise. Her false teeth stood in a glass of water beside the bed. This I accounted, I suppose, for the narrowness of her face. Still fluffy, her white hair frizzed over her dead face. Mrs. Van Took sat at a distance from the bed. Her face, a foreshortened mass of flesh, betrayed no expression, but her hands seemed to be tearing at each other in ceaseless agitation. An unknown woman wearing a grey overall came in carrying a towel, a soap dish containing a piece of yellow kitchen soap, and a bucket of water. Her movements were precise and detached. In a methodical way she removed the bedclothes, revealing the entire corpse, which was almost fully dressed. The effects of the poisoned fudge must have started before she had time to put on her nightdress, poor thing. Later I learnt that she had not gone to a supper, informing Mrs. Van Took that she felt livery and had a bad migraine. She must have died while everybody was at supper. This would explain why nobody had heard her call in the last moments of agony. Now the woman in the grey overall was stripping off Maud's clothes. She did this with certain difficulty, as rigor mortis must have set in during the night. A moment later Anna Wirtz was clutching my arm convulsively, and we both almost fell through the skylight onto the incredible sight below. Maud's stark, naked corpse was that of a venerable old gentleman. I shall never quite remember how Anna and I got down the ladder without breaking our necks. We must have negotiated it somehow. We saw Dr. Gambit in the distance, hurrying towards the double bungalow, and hastened to put as much distance as possible between the death chamber and ourselves. As we emerged from the undergrowth, we collided with Georgina Sykes, who claimed to have thought she heard a water buffalo under the bushes and had stopped to make sure. Anna Wirtz disappeared as if she had a werewolf after her. "And what the hell, may I ask, were you doing trampling around in the bushes with Anna Wirtz?" asked Georgina as I picked twigs out of my hair. "You sounded like a stampede of African water buffaloes." "For goodness sake, don't shout so loud," I said anxiously. "Somebody might hear you. Come to the bee pond and I will tell you everything." "Poor old Maud died of acute cirrhosis of the liver during the night," said Georgina. "The Gambit assembled us in the workroom and told us all about how we should use death for renewed self-conscious observation. She was no chicken, but one never thinks it happens quite so suddenly." I decided to tell Georgina the whole unpleasant affair, as I began to suspect her life might be in danger. I began tentatively. "Maud could not have died of a liver complaint. Her complexion was far too fresh. People who die of cirrhosis have yellow skins like Natasha." "Maud always plastered her face with pink goo," said Georgina. "You couldn't have told her if she was turquoise blue and all that stuff." "Maud Summers did not die of cirrhosis of the liver." We had arrived at the bee pond, which was deserted by all but the working bees. We sat on a stone bench, and I told Georgina the whole story of how I had watched Mrs. Van Took and Natasha put poison in the fudge, how Maud had followed Natasha and afterwards stolen the fatal sweetmeat. Then the dramatic episode on the bungalow roof, where we had discovered that dainty, feminine Maud was really a man. "Suffering cobras," said Georgina, who had gone pale. "The fudge must have been meant for me. She had it all arranged." The little reconciliation feast that Natasha had offered Georgina near the kitchen had been a deliberately planned murder. "We had better get Gambit at once," said Georgina. "They must call in the police. If we were in the United States, they would both go to the lethal chamber and be frizzled to lard in the electric chair. I wouldn't mind paying anything up to $10 to watch." "There is no capital punishment here," I told Georgina, "but they might make them work on a chain gang, cracking rocks with pickaxes and whipped by colossal Nubians wearing red loincloths." Georgina made a wry grimace. All that will happen is that they will be given a nice sitting room in the ladies' jowl, and they will give fudge parties twice a week and spiritualist seances on Sundays." "Of course, if they prove poor Maud was murdered," I said, after some reflection, "Natasha would pretend that she had made the fudge to poison the rats she talked about." "Who ever heard of making chocolate fudge for rats?" replied Georgina. "They use old lumps of putrefied cheese." We set out to look for Dr. Gambit, but only succeeded in finding Mrs. Gambit, who was stirring potato soup in the kitchen. "Dr. Gambit will not receive anybody today. I think it is very frivolous of you both to ask for an interview about personal problems when the doctor is worried out of his mind," said Mrs. Gambit with her tight-lipped smile. "This is urgent," said Georgina. "We must see him at once." "Nevertheless, Dr. Gambit cannot attend to personal matters today," replied Mrs. Gambit. "I will now ask you to attend the cleaning of your own bungalows and go through the day in a controlled and orderly manner, in spite of the sad event which has upset our usual routine." Obviously it was hopeless to insist further, and we were unable to talk to Dr. Gambit until the following day, after Maud's funeral. This seemed a pity, as they would no doubt have all the trouble of digging her up again, but there was no more we could do. In the meantime we walked around the garden, discussing the whole affair from every possible angle. "Who would ever have dreamed Maud was really a man in disguise?" I asked Georgina. "All those cami knickers and dainty blouses. Aren't you surprised out of your life?" "I am not surprised at all," said Georgina. "I knew Maud was really a man the moment she arrived." "How could you conceivably have known that?" I asked in astonishment. "She looked more like a woman than any of us." "I knew Arthur Summers when he had a curio shop in New York," said Georgina. "But there was no reason on earth why I should give away his little secret, seeing that he never did me any harm in his life. Why he should have chosen such an awful name as Maud was his own business." "But why should he shut himself up in an old ladies' home?" I asked. "Surely he would have found something more amusing. He had a little money of his own, I believe." "Well, since you know the kernel of the story, I might as well tell you the whole story. It won't do poor Arthur any harm now. Years ago, Arthur Summers bought a very small shop on 8th Avenue, where he filled with all sorts of repulsive garbage that he called curios. I used to live next door, with the Abyssinian I told you about, so I used to pop in now and again and chat with Arthur about my little troubles, and we became quite friendly. After a while I learnt that our artist's antiques were just a front for a small underground business. He sold tiny pink or blue pincushions covered with lace and stuffed with marijuana. It took me a long time to find out why his clients, who were often brawny deckhands, went in for so many dainty needlework accessories. Arthur made the pincushions himself. That was how he came to be so handy with a needle. He had a very cosy little business. Lots of people enjoy smoking marijuana. It cheers them up. One fine day he rented one of the free rooms over the shop to a lady landscape painter called Veronica Adams. Yes, the same Veronica Adams that now inhabits the cement boot near the toadstool where the Marquise lives. She still lives on painting all those yards of toilet paper. Well, at that period she was a fine figure of a woman, and Arthur fell madly in love with her. He didn't even collect the rent. The romantic attachment must have made Arthur careless, because he started selling pink pin cushions to the New York police by mistake. Things began to get very difficult, and Arthur would no doubt have gone to Sing Sing or somewhere like it if he had not been tipped off in time by Nut-Eyed Johnson, who ran a speakeasy in Greenwich Village. So Arthur and Veronica skipped over the border and ran a nightclub in Laredo. Veronica painted her landscapes whenever she had any free time. She also went in for Saturday night striptease when there were enough clients. I never actually saw her myself, but it is quite a thought if you look at her now. She must have worn ostrich feathers and beads. I believe Arthur confected the costumes. So there they were, as long as Veronica's figure was able to attract clients. Later on they were able to retire, and after spending some time in the Argentine they came here. Arthur thought a home for senile ladies was a tasteful end to a rather active life. Poor Arthur never bargained at having to share a bungalow with Mrs. Von Tuck. That was a sad blow, but he got used to it eventually. He always made a great point of the virtues of modesty, so Mrs. Von Tuck, nosy as she is, never found out the secret. Up till now, anyway. That is a schematic history of the life of Arthur Somers, who never expected to get murdered in a home for old ladies, although he might very well have been murdered almost anywhere else. Georgina seemed saddened as she thought backwards, and I made an effort to change the subject. "I wonder what marijuana tastes like," I asked, but Georgina had not heard. Perhaps she was thinking about Arthur and Veronica Adams. Maybe she was thinking about the Abyssinian. Arthur, or Maud's funeral, was a rather hurried affair. No relations came, so it was only attended by Dr. and Mrs. Gambit. Nobody found out what they thought about Arthur or Maud being a man. They never mentioned this in front of the community. Veronica went on painting on the toilet rolls. She was so bent one couldn't see her face, or guess if she suffered from the loss of her old lover. Personally, I spent a very bad night, worrying alternately about what I should tell Dr. Gambit, and quaking with apprehension when I thought about the sinister plot of Natasha and Mrs. Von Took. One would not have expected these kinds of problems in a home for senile old ladies. Dr. Gambit received Georgina and me shortly before lunchtime. His plump face looked unusually grey, and he twitched nervously. "Really," he told us irritably, "any kind of general advice on the work can be got from Mrs. Gambit. I'm excessively occupied. Please come to the point immediately." "Easy," said Georgina with her usual courage. "Maud Somers was murdered. She never had cirrhosis of the liver." Dr. Gambit gave something like a hoarse squeak, then, recovering himself, said, "Georgina, you must work strenuously to overcome your diseased imagination." "Diseased imagination be damned," said Georgina. "Just listen to Mrs. Leatherby's story about what she saw through the kitchen window." So I told my story. "Now," said Dr. Gambit, "if you have quite finished, I may say that I've never heard such a scurrilous piece of defamation in my entire life. I'm shocked above all at Georgina, who has been in the work now for some years. You are both prey to diseased imagination, one of the most deep-rooted vices of the human creature. I will organise some private exercises for you both, in order that you may overcome this terrible psychological sickness." "You must be mad," said Georgina angrily. "You sit there speaking about psychology, while we all might be poisoned at any meal. Von Took and Natasha ought to be put in the electric chair." "That," said Dr. Gambit, rising from his chair, "will be quite sufficient, Mrs. Sykes. I will see that you are given a sedative." "What about the rat poison that Mrs. Gambit bought for Natasha?" I asked. "Surely you will at least ask her to account for that." "Mrs. Gonzalez," said Dr. Gambit with dignity, "is a most remarkable woman, with a very high degree of extrasensory powers. It would be impossible for either you or Georgina Sykes to understand the delicate mechanism of her mind. This abusive gossip which you have invented only shows that you are fermenting with envy. And now I will bid you good day. Mrs. Gambit will give you a sedative." He opened the door and pushed us out of the study. Georgina and I had imagined all kinds of reactions, but we were entirely unprepared for a wall of total disbelief. We had nothing at all to say for almost 5 minutes. The idea of approaching Mrs. Gambit with our account of the murder seemed hopeless. All during lunch I kept giving Mrs. Von Took and Natasha surreptitious glances. Georgina and I ate practically nothing. It did not seem safe. In the afternoon I was told that I had a visitor, and I hurried into the parlour reserved for weekday callers. My surprise and delight were unbounded when I saw Carmela, looking very modish in a long tweed dress. Carmela's telepathy had told her that something was amiss. She had dreamt about me doing a Viennese waltz with an officer. "Dancing in dreams means either occult power or trouble," she told me, "so I knew you must be in some sort of trouble." I took Carmela to my favourite place, the bee pond, and there I poured out the whole story of how poor Maud Arthur had been murdered by mistake, and how we feared that mistake might be rectified at almost any moment. "I will give a solution in a few moments," said Carmela, who was rummaging in a large covered basket that she had brought. "In the meantime I had better give you the chocolate biscuits and the port before anybody comes. I put the port in a hot water bottle in case anyone might examine the basket. I also have a large file in case there were iron bars. There doesn't seem to be any, but you never know. You might be attacked, and then it would be very useful." "How very kind of you, Carmela. I wish I had something to give you too, but we never go out." "Never mind," said Carmela. "The cats are well, and so your only worry, as far as I can see, is the fact that you might get murdered any moment, either by error or design, and from your point of view it would come practically to the same thing. Of course, you must warn every possible victim in the place, and then, since Dr. Gambit refuses to take any action, you must all make a hunger strike." This was a really wonderful idea, although it was not inconceivable that Dr. and Mrs. Gambit might sit and tranquilly watch us all starve to death. I told Carmela my doubts. "You have no need to worry. I shall give the story to the newspapers if worse comes to worse." I could see the headlines: "Old Ladies' Home Strewn with Skeletons," or something like that, in Spanish. Not a pleasant thought, and hardly a solution from our point of view. However, being poisoned was worse perhaps than dying of starvation, and the latter usually had a simple remedy, since we lived in a place where food could be obtained. I told Carmela that I thought a hunger strike was an excellent plan. "You call a general meeting at midnight by torchlight," said Carmela, "and tell everybody that they are menaced by a mad murderess who will stop at nothing to claim her victim. Then you give out rations of chocolate biscuits I bought you. That ought to keep 7 or 8 people alive for almost a week. By that time, Dr. Gambit will have capitulated." "Supposing that Dr. Gambit sits and watches us starve to death?" I asked. "Then," said Carmela, "you simply tell him that I am in possession of all the facts, and that if I do not get a letter from you within 10 days, I shall make the whole matter public." "I must take care that Mrs. Von Took and Natasha don't get at the chocolate biscuits," I told Carmela. "We will bury those under the floorboards of your room," replied Carmela promptly. "Let us do that at once. I am anxious to see the lookout you live in with the false furniture." During the walk to my lookout, Carmela examined the other abodes with curiosity. "In spite of your letter," she remarked, "reality almost surpasses artistic description. Why are they made into such surpassably horrible shapes? They spoil the garden, which would look really beautiful and restful otherwise." "Dr. Gambit chooses each bungalow according to what he calls the azimuth vibrations from the lower nature. I got the lookout because it was the only vacancy left. Mrs. Gambit says I deserve to live in a boiled cauliflower, but they didn't have one made." "What a diabolical idea," said Carmela. "They must be sadistic." "We have to watch the workings of our own nasty nature," I continued, warming to the subject. "Dr. Gambit says the only way to salvation is self-observation. We also do some very complicated exercises." Having arrived at the lookout, we carefully closed the door. There were no keys, so we barricaded it with a chair. Then, hanging a cover over the window, we set to work on a loose floorboard. This was not too difficult, owing to the decrepit state of the bungalow. "Now I must go," said Carmela. "They might get suspicious if we stay shut up in here for too long. Remember all the details for the hunger strike. The meeting must be at midnight. If you can obtain a flag of skull and crossbones, it would be a great help. You can improvise torches from willow and sheets torn into stripes and dipped in oil. If possible, use snake oil. The odour is very stimulating. Once everyone is informed that there are 2 prisoners at large and that they are likely to die in frightful convulsions after any meal, you will find them all happy to collaborate. Choose a secluded spot in the garden. The bee pond would be well hidden from the house and from observation of the murderesses. This is, of course, a kind of mutiny, and if you are discovered by the authorities, they might turn machine guns on you. An armoured car would be most adequate, or even a small tank, although there might be some difficulties in getting these. You should be obliged to ask the collaboration of the army. I'm not sure if they lend out tanks, although they might have an old one. In any case, the meeting should take place with the greatest secrecy. If you can get people to come hooded, it would be better, because then they would not be recognised unless captured and tortured." Carmela went through this advice several times, then took her leave with a few final instructions, such as putting snipers in the trees around the bee pond, installing secret radio stations, and a series of outposts with tom-toms which would relay coded messages. After Carmela's stimulating visit, I was feeling quite excited and happy. It was not long before I met Georgina, to whom I immediately communicated our plans, omitting some of the less practical ones such as the tanks, the snake oil, the secret radio stations and the snipers. I emphasised the hunger strike as not only desirable, but urgently necessary. "I couldn't have thought of a better idea myself," said Georgina. "We must make the meeting tonight. After dinner everybody can pretend to go to their bungalows as usual, and when the Gambits, Von Tuck and Natasha are nicely tucked in, we sally forth and meet at the pond. We had better inform Veronica Adams, the Marquise, Christabel and Anna Wirtz so that they know more or less why we are meeting, and don't let on to Natasha and Mrs. Von Tuck," I said. "People can say they have a stomachache and can't eat supper. This might even be a good way to initiate the hunger strike." So being agreed, we set out to tell the other ladies of our plans. Dinner that night was a most lugubrious affair. The only persons to take food were Dr. Gambit, Mrs. Von Tuck and Natasha. Mrs. Gambit had retired early with aspirin and a sick headache. The rest of us sat and watched them eat. The tension was appalling. "I am not going to attempt to find out why you have all lost your appetites," said Dr. Gambit at the end of the meal. "I will, however, say this. Hysterical complaints have no place in the work. Psychosomatic illnesses kills just as effectively as any other physical disease. If you deliberately allow your lower centres to take hold of your organism, you will soon become victims to a mass deterioration which may have serious consequences." With that he dabbed his mouth with a table napkin and rolled it up into the bone napkin ring which we all used. Clean table napkins every day would have made the laundry bill excessive, according to Mrs. Gambit. Evening recreation in the lounge did not last as late as usual. Everybody was relieved when Dr. Gambit rang the bell, and we all retired to our respective habitations. The abbess looked down upon us with her sardonic smile. There was no moon that night, but luckily we all had candles, which were put in each bungalow for occasions when the electricity failed, which it most often did. By the time we were all assembled at the bee pond, it must have been about 11:30. The circumstances were so unusual that I hardly noticed the curious fact that some bees were still buzzing over the still dark water of the fountain. I heard them in some dormant part of my consciousness, although I have since wondered if it were not the same acoustic peculiarity produced by my hearing trumpet. I opened the meeting with a complete enumeration of the facts which were all substantiated by Georgina. Then biscuits were passed around and there was a general discussion. We all agreed that a hunger strike was by far the most practical solution, although there was a certain doubt as to how long my supply of chocolate biscuits would keep us alive. In order to combat the chilly evening air, I had bought the hot water bottle filled with sweet port, and we passed this around now and again. It would really have been a very pleasant gathering if we had not been menaced by starvation at a future date. "I also have a supply of sweet biscuits that I would be pleased to put at the disposal of the community," said Christabel Burns. I brought a biscuit for each person in my pockets, as I had also visualised our hungry condition after retiring without dinner. The supply was somewhat limited, so I only bought each person one biscuit. Happily, Mrs. Lubberby also has a private supply of chocolate biscuits, which are very nourishing. We ought to be able to hold out quite a time, at least until Dr. Gambit is sensible enough to expel Natasha and Mrs. Von Tuck from the institution. Christabel handed us each a biscuit, which was neatly wrapped in soft paper. They were so small that each one would hardly have made a mouthful. "You will find a scrap of paper in each biscuit with your fortune written on it," said Christabel. "I suggest each one of us reads out her own fortune." Each person bit her biscuit in two, and we read out our scraps of paper in turns. We were sitting in a circle around the pond. The order was moonwise: Veronica Adams, the Marquise, Anna Wirtz, Georgina, Christabel Burns. I was last. "Although you have given up hope, you will meet true love again," read Veronica Adams. "The battle is almost won. Do not dissipate yourself unnecessarily. Victory is near." This was for the Marquise. "Toil and trouble will not always be your lot. A great change is imminent. Be of good heart." Anna Wirtz was about to make some commentary, but Christabel held up her hand for silence. and she was accepted by mutual agreement as the head of the meeting. The candles guttered in a slight breeze. Your courage and goodwill are soon to reap a reward. Do not fear those who bear you ill will. They shall soon fall in shame, read Georgina, cackling with mirth. The next person was Christabel, who read, Devotion and service to a holy cause is your destiny. I unscrewed my own scrap of paper and read out, Help! I'm prisoner in the tower. There was a slight pause, and Christabel, as if to avoid discussion, pulled a very small tom-tom from under her shawl and began to pat it in rhythmic beats. We began by nodding our heads in time to the drumming, then our feet. Soon we were dancing round and around the pond, waving our arms and generally behaving in a very strange manner. At the time, none of us seemed to find anything unusual about our weird dance. None of us felt very tired. Even Veronica Adams, who was over 90, pranced around as merrily as the rest. Never before had I experienced the joy of rhythmic dance, even in the days of foxtrot in the arms of some illegible young man. We seemed inspired by some marvellous power, which poured energy into our decrepit carcasses. Christabel began to chant in time to the rhythm of her drums. Boat-zira, ha-ha, Hecate come, descend on us to the sound of my drum. In Carla Ictum, my bird is a mole, up goes the equator and down the North Pole. Eptalum, zampolum, the power to increase, here comes the North Lights and a flight of wild bees. Inkla bells I zampolem, the drum, high queen of Tartarus, hasten to come. This chant was repeated time and time again, till a cloud gathered over the round pond, and we all shrieked in unison, Zampolem, Ava, Ava, queen of all bees. Then it seemed that the cloud formed itself into an enormous bumblebee as big as a sheep. She wore a tall iron crown studded with rock crystals, the stars of the underworld. All this may have been a collective hallucination, although nobody has yet explained to me what a collective hallucination actually means. The monstrous queen bee slowly revolved over the water, beating her crystalline wings so rapidly that they emitted a pale light. As she faced me, I was thrilled to notice a sudden strange resemblance to the abbess. At that moment she closed one eye, as big as a teacup, in a prodigious wink. Then she slowly faded away, beginning with her barbed sting and ending with the tips of her curly antennae. A delicious scent of wild honey was left in the air. For some miraculous reason nobody heard our revels. We all regained our respective bungalows unmolested, to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Before we retired, Christabel told us that we would meet again within 3 days, at midnight. By mutual and silent consent, we never discussed the apparition of Zampolem, the High Queen of Bees, yet we were full of courage and determination to carry out our purpose.